Okay, and we are live. Should be live, sweet. Okay, so presume that this is live streaming right now. We are going to start the next workshop as part of this open day. I'm very happy and we are live. Our guest trainer for this session is going to be Ahsan, very qualified speaker. Won nationals. How many times? 3 times?
Twice.
2 times. Still very accomplished. Also won Austro ESL last year. And he'll be telling you how to win from PM.
Thank you, DJ. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahsan, and in conjunction with WoLCE's Open Day, I am doing this workshop on PM speeches. And I'll be telling you how do you win from the first speech. Now, this is not a definitive guide, so to say. So even if you follow this 100%, it doesn't mean that you will definitely win right after giving the first speech, although you will be setting your team up for victory if you follow things that are discussed in this speech. The second thing that I want to add as a disclaimer is that this is not gospel. So I would prefer if that the information that I'm delivering to you in this workshop is assumed in a very flexible way, that anyone who is watching this workshop can take maybe the core message or the core idea of the things that I'm talking about and then translating it into different methods that you are more comfortable with executing within your speech itself. So is it working now? Yep, all right, perfect. So before I move on into like the main components of today's workshop, allow me to like just briefly give a quick introduction on being a Prime Minister. And I'm going to split this very easily into 2 parts. The first part is on the perks of being a Prime Minister. Now, maybe many of you who are watching this workshop, you aren't entirely sure yet on which speaker role you would want to like take up, right? Some people are confused between which position they are most comfortable with, whether it be the Prime Minister speech, whether it be deputy speeches, or whether it be whip speeches. So maybe this part of the introduction can give you a better idea of whether the Prime Minister role is something that resonates with you. And firstly, let's look at the perks of being a Prime Minister. The first perk that I've identified throughout the years of being the Prime Minister, which is the main role that I assume in most of the teams that I'm part of, is that prep time is dedicated to you. A lot of the time during prep, you're going to realize that a lot of the information, a lot of the material, a lot of the ideas that are being discussed are more focused towards what the Prime Minister or what the first speaker needs to have in their speech. And this can either be a good thing or a bad thing. What do I mean by this? It can be a good thing that you have the speech completely prepared by the time it's your turn to give the speech. And that might mean you are a lot more comfortable with the speech itself. But it can be a bad thing in the sense that sometimes speakers tend to over-rely on the material that has been prepared as opposed to being a lot more flexible with the material within their speech. So this can result in multiple instances where speakers are typing out or writing out entire speeches versus being a lot more improvised during the delivery of their speech. So that is why whilst I do still see this as a perk, it can also be something that might be a bit negative. So like depends on how you see it. The second thing that is a perk here, and it's also more of a subjective perk, is that you're done with the speech early, right? So because you're the first speaker, you're going to be done with the speech in probably the first 14 minutes of the debate. But a responsibility that comes with being done with your speech early is helping out your teammates. What do I mean by this? When you help out your teammates, this can exist in a few ways. Number one, in that you are giving your input of the debate as it is happening after your speech to your teammates in terms of responses, in terms of certain contributions that you think can be meaningful. This would be it would be good if these are passed down to the rest of the batch. But also secondly, this could also mean POI duty. So for those of you who are not as familiar with debating, POIs are points of information, and these are questions that are asked to the other team during when they are giving their speech. So these are questions that you can assist with because your other teammates might be more focused on preparing their own speeches. So this is where you can come in handy. The second part of the introduction that is on responsibilities as a Prime Minister. Now, there are a couple of responsibilities as a Prime Minister that we want to take note of. And that is firstly on the foundation of the debate, that you are kind of deciding how the debate is going to turn out and how it's going to look like. So teams can do all kinds of predictions, they can do all kinds of forecasting on how they think a debate is going to turn out. But you can change that. You can decide from your first speaker's speech how you want the debate to go about. What are the more important issues that you would probably want to focus on? Although most of the times this is going to be quite uniform in that everyone is going to have a similar understanding. It's still setting up the foundation of the debate, which you have most of the control over. The second thing here is in setting your team up for victory, and this is what I talked about right at the start of this workshop, right? That as a Prime Minister, the way in which you can view winning from first as like something that you can do as a Prime Minister is by how you're approaching this Prime Minister speech, how you're approaching this first speech. Because if you approach it in the right way, this is when you're much better able to give your team that upper hand from the start itself versus, approaching the debate in a more ascending way where things are only being completed by the time it's third or final speech. Now, this is not the most preferable way of approaching a speech, and that is why as a Prime Minister, if you are doing all the necessary things, completing all the arguments, setting up the debate in a way that is much more advantageous for your team, this is definitely a pathway to victory for your side. The third responsibility then as a Prime Minister is the first impression. And this is very, very important because as much as judges are professional debaters themselves, and they know how debating works and you would want them to be as objective as possible, they are also human. And this is when it is a responsibility as a Prime Minister to make sure you're tapping into that human subconscious of the importance of a first impression. And that is why we would want to give the best version of our case as best as possible in the first speech versus it being just an ascending way and things being completed as things go. Because that first impression can solidify your position within that debate and again, set your team up for victory in the later stages. Let's then move on to an overview of one of the things that we're going to be covering. Number one is general tips that I would give from my experience of being a first speaker, which is, like I said, the position and the role that I've assumed for much of my debating career. Secondly, we're going to look at framing and how do we set up the debate. Thirdly is arguments. So this is going to go into argument construction territory, which is not exclusively Prime Minister stuff, but it's also going to help you in coming up and constructing arguments and ideas. Next, we're going to look at impacting. Although this is kind of part of argument construction, I would say that I would want to deal with this separately because I think impacting is a really important component of argument construction that requires a whole area of its own. And lastly, then we're going to look at LO or lead of opposition speeches, which technically is a first speech as well. Most of the LO speech is going to be covered within this itself. But then as a finality to the workshop, we're going to look at maybe some additional stuff that can be covered in the lead of opposition speech. Let's now move on to the general tips. I have 4 tips here which I think can be helpful. And that is firstly, clarity. I think it is extremely important for a first speaker to be clear. And I mean this in both ways. Number one, in manner, which means that the way that you are giving your speech needs to be very understandable to an average person. especially to the judge who doesn't know who you are, who doesn't know how you speak, who probably doesn't, has never met you before, doesn't know your style. This is where you would want to have a style that is the most neutral as possible, but at the same time, very clear. But I also mean clarity in the way in which things are being explained. So you don't want to be complicated, or you don't want to jump to like the outcomes of your case, right? You would want to start with the most intuitive parts of the case that can be understood by the average people, so that that important foundation is then set for your following speakers to then take over and develop it beyond what is the most intuitive parts of the case. So that is why clarity is very important, because judges most likely do not know you, and for strangers who do not know you, you want to make sure that you're giving a speech that is as clear as possible to them. The second thing here is the most important material needs to be carried by you. I don't know about others, like the strategies of other teams, but I do think that this is probably the best strategy, in that you are carrying the most important material as the first speaker. And I think this is important for a few reasons. The first reason I can think about is just for like the maturity of the debate, right? If you as the first speaker are running a lot of non-contentious stuff in the first speech, or even if it's non-contentious, material that might not be as contentious that it can be, and you're keeping a lot of arguments for maybe the second speech, I don't think this is going to be helpful for your team, but also for the debate in general, because that is when the debate is going to lack in terms of the discussions that happen following the first speech. And again, it's going to result in that ascending kind of debate that we talk about, where a lot of the issues are only being, a lot of the arguments are only being completed by the time it's the third speech. And that is why I think it's very important for first speakers to carry the most important material, because you want to make sure that as a first speaker, you are carrying the burden of proving most of the things or most of the ideas that you want to push forth as a team. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the debate can happen from your speech itself, and you're not keeping things for a second speaker. I think second speeches are probably just the way I would frame things is as a sip for the first speaker. So even if there are no arguments left for the second speech, that is fine. I think they can be a lot more mature and independent in coming up with arguments themselves, but also a lot of rebuilding of the arguments that you talk about as a first speech. The third general tip that I have is on method loading, and I added an asterisk at the end of it. And the reason why I did this is because I think that this is subjective to the speaker that's giving the speech. A lot of times, speakers attempt to method load, or in like another word for it is front loading, but they fail. And the reason for this is because they can't keep up with the speed of which they need to be going at while method loading. So some speakers have that ability. They are incredibly fluent speakers who can give fast but understandable speeches that is clear at the same time, which allows them to deliver a lot of matter, a lot of arguments in the first speech itself. But some speakers don't. Some speakers need to be a lot much more composed. Some speakers have a much more relaxed way of giving their speech. So if these kinds of speakers are forced to give a speech that focuses on a lot of matter in the first speech, they are going to kind of struggle. So that is why I added an asterisk that if you can do this, then that would be good, because then you are, like what I said, this kind of supports the second general tip on the most important material. So you're getting a lot of the material out already in the first speech. So that is something that's preferable. But if you can't do this, don't worsen it or don't screw it up for the rest of your team. Do what you are most comfortable with, and that will, allow for your team to be in the best position possible. The last thing then is on rhetoric. And I think this is something that's very, that's kind of understated in modern day debating, which is kind of matter heavy and focusing more on arguments and material and contributions, things like that. I think rhetoric is still important. And what do I mean by rhetoric is more of the persuasive language that you're using in your speech, right? Because a lot of the things that you're talking about in the first speaker speech is going to be very intuitive, maybe at certain times quite simplistic as well, given that you want to make sure people are understanding you as much as possible. But I feel like this is the opportunity then for you to deliver or execute a lot of the material that's going to be in your speech, whilst it is simplistic, in a more mature way or in a more persuasive way. What do I mean by this? So this can look like, using occasionally flowery language, using vocabulary that is uncommon, talking a lot about why should we care about the issue at hand, why is this such a pertinent discussion that needs to happen. I think these are all aspects of a first speaker speech that are kind of understated, but if you look at videos of really good first speaker speeches, for example, also in the Thessaloniki WoLCE finals, or a lot of other like really good first speaker speeches, you're going to realize that this is something that they practice quite diligently in using a lot of persuasive language in order to get that, in order to like nudge people towards your side, without using much material, without using much arguments, without using much like matter, but more towards the language or the persuasiveness of which is the ideas of his speech is being delivered at. That is for general tips. Let's then move on to the first like matter-specific component, which is framing, right? I think framing is an incredibly important part of the first speaker speech, although as like debating evolves, a lot of teams are kind of trying to cut down or trim their framing in favor of more argumentative material. Now, I'm kind of in the middle about this. I think framing is important, and I think that sometimes you would want to cover certain things in the framing, but at the same time, I do think that you don't want to take too long with your framing, right? The golden rule is 90 seconds. I would say that anything longer than 90 seconds of framing is an overkill, right? You would want to make sure that everything that you would want to frame is being covered within that 90-second period, so that the rest of the time within your speech can be spent more on matter, can be spent more on the more contentious parts of your speech. Now, what are components of framing then? And this is basically the introductory part of the entire debate, right? Like this is the part of the debate where we're talking about like the different words, the different segments, the different components within the motion itself. The first part here is on defining or definition. And this is when I think that the first disclaimer that I want to put out is a common myth or misconception that a lot of times beginner debaters or amateur debaters make, is that they literally define words, right? Like by the dictionary. And I notice this a lot in high school tournaments alike, or like other novice tournaments, where speakers are literally quoting the dictionary in terms of the definitions that they're providing in the debate. Now, this is not helpful whatsoever. And I'll tell you why. Because people generally understand what these words mean. For example, if I like the example of the motion that's right there, that you can see is that this house regrets the perception of soldiers as heroes. I understand, and everyone probably understands each of these words individually. The question then becomes is, what does this mean? What does perception of soldiers as heroes mean? What does this look like, right? And I think this is more of the focus of what definition should be, in that you're not literally defining, but more so explaining what these things look like. Other parts of the definition, which I would also include, is setting. And this is when we set where this debate is taking place, what is the time frame of which this debate is taking place, etc. Right? And I'll include this as part of the definition, because I think this is when you're kind of deciding the parameters of the debate, right? Like what are, like, assuming, like, if we take this, the word framing in the literal sense, how are we framing it? What are we setting as like the parameters or the frames of the debate as like parts of which we're focusing on? So I think that's the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of definitions. The second thing here is on status quo. And this is probably the more important part of the framing that requires a lot more explanation. And this is where we build more of the context behind the debate. This is when we talk about what is happening right now. What does the situation on the ground look like? Who are these stakeholders that are involved? And after we do this, within the status quo itself is when we have our problem statement. So once we have defined, once we have defined the motion, once we have talked about what the current situation looks like, is when we have to say, what is the problem with this situation, right? What needs to be solved here? What needs to be remedied in this situation? Because without understanding the problem, people are less likely going to agree with you with the solutions that you're trying to push. And this is especially true for excuse me. This is especially true for policy motions that we want to talk about, where you're introducing a ban or you're trying to legalize something. This is when you need to kind of talk about what is a problem that's existed in status quo that requires to be remedied. Thirdly, then, is on the position. And this is more of like what the debate is about, right? Now that you have talked about the problem of the debate, now that you have introduced a problem statement and you have said that this is something that needs to be solved, now we need to talk about what is the debate then about, right? What is the position that both sides have to assume in order for this debate to be meaningful? And to do this, we can do this in a very simple way in talking about the burden of proof, right? Or what now modern day debating calls it is the win condition. And this is where we talk about what does the proposition or government team need to prove in order to win the debate, and what does the other team, the opposition team, assuming you're on government, need to do in order to win the debate. And this can be done like in a very one-liner kind of way, or it can also be done in a very segmented way where you are specifically spelling out what the government needs to do and what the opposition needs to do. A valid inclusion as part of the position is also what the debate is not about, right? So for example, if we bring back the earlier motion on this house regrets the perception of soldiers as heroes, the debate is definitely about whether or not this perception is something that has been beneficial to the treatment of soldiers, is something that has been beneficial to maybe the scrutiny of the military. But what this debate is not about soldiers doing the right thing or doing something that's necessary. So opposition cannot just say that, soldiers are doing something that's necessary, therefore they need to be viewed as heroes. That's not really what the debate is about, right? Because we are not arguing whether or not soldiers are doing something that's necessary. We are arguing whether what they're doing needs to be perceived in a heroic manner by the rest of society. So this can be a valid inclusion as part of your position, part of the debate as well. Now, lastly then, as part of the framing is the model. And this is when we talk about policy motion specifically. For example, this house would ban smoking, right? We need to talk about what this ban is going to look like. Are we going to ban all kinds of smoking, which means tobacco smoking, maybe cigarette smoking, but also at the same time e-cigarettes and vapes and stuff like that? Is that also going to be included as part of the ban? Who are we banning it for? Is it everyone like of all ages, or are we only going to ban it for a certain age group of people? So yeah, what does the system look like? And this has to be followed by an enforcement. What happens if people don't follow this model? What happens if people still smoke? Are we going to, or not just smoke? What happens if people maybe still sell cigarettes to, in the event that we have a complete ban of smoking? Are we going to, fine them? Are we going to jail them? Are we going to take away their business licenses if they sell cigarettes when they're not supposed to? What does it look like in that instance is something that needs to be briefly explained, right? That this does not have to be a whole policy paper on what you're fighting for and what the system on your side looks like, but it needs to at least be a brief explanation of how you are going to regulate it in your subject debate. Now, in more advanced debates, where you're talking about more advanced forms of policies, this requires a bit of work and requires a bit of like a bit of thought put into it, especially when you're dealing with a lot of variables. Maybe like this house would subsidize healthcare for the poor in urban areas. So there are a lot of variables in those motions, and that requires probably a lot more of a comprehensive model. But for the meantime, we are not really going to look at that because I assume that most people here are not really going to be debating really advanced policy motions. So for the meantime, the general understanding is keep things brief, keep things easy to understand. And that is for framing. So the TLDR for framing is anything vague that needs to be explained should be explained. If you feel like the motion is not explaining that just by virtue of wording, that kind of needs to be framed. And I want to also add that framing doesn't necessarily have to be at the top of the speech, right? And that is how we practice more efficiency with framing, right? Because I realize that when I tell some of the people that I coach that framing is made up of this components, they end up thinking that everything needs to be at the top of the speech. And that is why sometimes you realize when you're framing in your speech, you will take a bit more time, right? Like sometimes framing goes into 2 minutes, sometimes even 2.5 minutes, and you'll realize that, oh no, you spent a bit too much time on framing. But the way in which we cut down framing is that we can leave a lot of the things we want to frame within the argument itself, especially when we want to talk about how maybe certain stakeholders react to a certain policy, or how maybe governments behave in certain crisis situations. Like these are all things that can be explained within the argument itself. And I would say that it's much more beneficial to have that within the argument itself because it's going to be a lot more proximate. It's going to be a lot closer versus if a lot of these things are being explained at the top of the speech, and then you're going to have arguments that kind of are relying on these explanations at the top of the speech in order to operate or in order to be true, then people might miss that, right? People might miss out, people might forget what you said at the top of the speech, judges might not have caught it. So that's where you want to be safe. So you are keeping a lot of these explanations, or I would say characterizations, closer to the arguments so that it's a lot more proximate is the right word. Yeah. So that is for framing then. Let's then move on into argument construction. And I feel like this is going to be like the meat of what we're talking about today. And I feel it's quite important, especially because when I said earlier, a lot of the prep time is going to be dedicated actually to the PM speech. So this is when you as the Prime Minister need to make sure that all the parts of the arguments are within your speech and you're not missing out on anything that's important. Let's start out with the header. Now, headers need to be catchy. Header is the word that you say at the start of your argument that kind of names your argument, right? Like, for example, you have a pet. You're going to name that pet, right? You're not just going to call it a dog or a cat. The same way when you have an argument, you're going to name that argument. You're going to give it a title, right? It has to be catchy and on point. You don't want to have a header that's really long, that it ends up being super boring and judges are just like, they just zone out at the point at which you say this header. And when you say these headers, it's preferable that you're making things as clear as possible. What do I mean by this? It's like saying the first argument that I have is maybe why is X necessary? So you would want to number things as well, because that allows judges to track you very easily. So they know which contribution this is, how many contributions do you have? Like number one, why is X necessary? Number two, why is Y justified, etc., etc. So being clear with your header is very important because it allows the judge to like kind of capture the soul of the argument that you're trying to make. So that's on the header. And like it's said in the slide as well, this header, if you can't think of like a really attractive way to kind of phrase it, what I most of the time do is just answer a question, right? Like, why is X necessary? Why is Y justified? why is this morally reprehensible? What are the, like, why is this more beneficial than harmful? So how does this encourage more positive behavior? So you can answer those questions. And because then it becomes very clear within your explanation itself how this question is being answered, and that kind of helps you in your explanation because you then know what exactly is the question that needs to be answered within the argument. The second part to your argument then needs to be the premise. And this is when I think a lot of people get confused. Because what is a premise, right? A premise is basically the starting point of the argument. It is the assumption that is necessary for the argument to be true. And what is an example of this, right? So for example, when you talk about this house will ban smoking, for example, and the header is, why is banning smoking justified? Now, the first premise that you would have, or that you can have, is maybe why addiction is bad, or the fact that addiction is bad, right? That is the assumption that you're making. So when you make that assumption, you have to explain why this assumption is true. So that is why you're able to segment your argument much better when you have premises. So when you say, why is banning smoking justified? You can't just have one reason, but when you have premises, you can kind of split the argument up into different parts, so you can have multiple reasons why banning smoking is justified. So like the example that I've included right there is that the first premise is that addiction is bad because the first premise is addiction is bad, or you can phrase this in much better ways like addiction is an illusion, or why addiction is Hobson's choice. So this is when we kind of weaponize the rhetoric. But we also have a second premise here, which is that it hurts other people, or that it results in negative externalities. So these are also other reasons that we can include as to why banning smoking is justified. But the important reminder that I have to make here is that making these premises alone is not sufficient. If I just say addiction is bad, and then I say, and my second premise is it hurts other people, and then my conclusion to the argument is XYZ, that's not going to cut it, right? I have to explain why these premises are true. Because remember, the nature of a premise is an assumption. It's an assumption that is necessary for the argument to be executed. So while it is an assumption, we need to prove why this is a fair assumption to make, or why this is a true assumption to make. So when we say addiction is bad or addiction is an illusion, right? This is where we talk about maybe how humans who are addicted behave, right? That they oftentimes think when they start smoking, they think that, and when they become addicted, they think smoking is then something that is necessary in order for them to live their life. That they cannot go maybe the 2 hours without smoking, or they cannot, go through a meal without smoking or whatever. But this is the effect of addiction, and this is the effect of the effect that smoking has onto the human psyche. That it makes people believe like they need to smoke when they actually don't. That they actually, before they smoked, when they were children, when they were adolescents, they lived perfectly normal lives without smoking. So this is kind of the explanation to it. So definitely you can give a lot more examples, a lot more analysis. I'm just not telling you what the explanation to proving the premise might look like. Similarly, for the second premise, when you talk about why it can hurt other people and why it can result in negative externalities, is another premise that you have to prove. So you talk about why smoking doesn't necessarily just hurt the people who opt into the action of smoking, but it can also hurt other people who don't necessarily opt into it. When you smoke outdoors, people who pass by you when you're smoking are also hurt. When you smoke in your homes, the people, your family members who don't opt into it, your children, your wives, other people in your house that maybe don't necessarily opt into smoking are also hurt by it. So that is why banning smoking is justified. 2 reasons. And it is always best to have multi-leveled arguments, right? You would want to make sure that your arguments don't just deal with one idea, but deals with multiple ideas. That's how we have really cohesive and comprehensive arguments that can work really well. And the simple mathematical formula to like a multi-level argument is P1, which is premise 1, plus P2, premise 2, equals the argument header. So if by me answering why addiction is bad, and me answering that it hurts other people and it results in negative externalities, proves the argument header of why banning smoking is justified. So this is a simple mathematical formula. So this is how we break it down. Why is banning smoking justified? You have your first premise, you have your second premise. You combine these two premises and you will end up with the argument header and you will answer the argument header. So yeah. Moving on then into thirdly, the analysis. And this is how basically we explain why the argument is true. Why the premise is true. And there are a few components to this and a few ways that we can do this. Firstly, it's logical reasons. So these are logical reasons that we use to explain why the premise is true. So when we say addiction is bad, yes, addiction is bad because people once they start smoking will never stop smoking, right? They're going to embark on this journey of this terrible journey of addiction, where it's very difficult for them to realize that smoking is something that they don't need, right? Or we can also give examples of this. So, for example, a teenager that ends up starting to smoke is going to result in a mindset or a mentality that as they grow older, they feel smoking is something that's necessary. Or we can also talk about maybe things like peer pressure or media influence, and why media influences people to think maybe smoking is something that's cool or whatever. Or we can also use a lot of analogies or thought experiments to support whatever premise that we're trying to make. So I can't think of a thought experiment from the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure you all know what analogies are. Right? It's a similar situation that allows you to prove why something else is true in another situation as well. So maybe an analogy for smoking can be something like if someone told me that like a feeling is if someone told me that if I had this feeling for the rest of my life, I can be really happy, then I'm going to chase that feeling for the rest of my life. And I'm going to be convinced that this is a feeling that can truly make me happy. That is something that smoking can be like. Now, that's a very bad analogy because I'm trying to think of it from the top of my head, but you guys get the gist of it, right? And it can really help you in improving your analysis. So whatever that you feel can be made into persuasive reasons to support why that premise is true can be something that's used, right? As long as it is persuasive, as long as it can be relatable to an average person, then you can definitely use it as a means of analysis. Now, the last part here to the argument is the comparative. And this is a part which I think a lot of people take for granted. A lot of people, after they are done, even if they have like multiple layers to their arguments, like the premise 1, premise 2, sometimes they even have a third premise within the argument, they conclude that third premise and then they move on to the next argument. I don't think that this is a clean way of doing things, because like what happens then, right? You just proved to me 3 things, but I don't know why these 3 things that you told me are important or like comparable to what the other side is talking about, right? Like what does the situation look like on the other side, right? Like it will sound very one-sided if you just leave the argument there, which is why comparatives are really important, because at the end of the argument is when you have an opportunity to tell the judge why the situation in your world as a result of the arguments that you have made is much better than the situation in the other world, in the other world meaning the side of the others. So I think this is when you have an opportunity to not just talk about the trade-off, like the idea of a trade-off. So like what are we, like even if we lose out on this benefit, what are we gaining on? And whilst the other side, they get this benefit, but they are losing out on something that's much more important, which is what your side promises to people, right? So I think it's not just an opportunity to do that, but it's also an opportunity to rebut. And this is when like you can preemptively deal with a lot of the things that the other side or the other team might want to talk about, especially if you're the first speech of the debate, right? Because you haven't heard anything much. So a lot of times, a lot of Prime Minister speeches, because they are the first speech, they sound very value neutral, they sound very non-contentious. But comparatives then are the opportunity within a Prime Minister speech to not sound non-contentious, to deal with a case coming from the other side that might not have been even made yet. So I think that is definitely an ability that you can do. And a simple way to do this is comparing your worst case to the other team's best case and telling the judge why even in your worst case, you get that benefit. Now, sometimes it's not that easy, I understand, right? Sometimes your worst case is kind of bad and the other team's best case is pretty good. But this is when we need to use like kind of gaslighting kind of technique in trying to break that best case that comes from the other side. Since we are the first speakers and the other team hasn't spoken yet, we have an ability to kind of manipulate what the best case on the other team looks like. And the onus then, the burden then, is on them to kind of respond to your characterization, to your illustration of what their best case looks like. And because you had the first movers, I mean, I'll call it the first movers advantage, not literally the first movers advantage, but because you went first, right, and you had that advantage of illustrating whatever their world looks like before they did, I think you need to take advantage of this and you can use it to manipulate what the other side looks like. So you can make their best case sound like not really the best case. But if you can't do this, then that's when we look at the middle ground. Because debates generally are not won on extremes, right? You can win on like something extreme, but a judge will just say that that might not have been the most important consideration in the debate, given that like the extreme doesn't have the most probable case, right? The extremes are simply just the ends of the spectrum. We want to focus more on what probably exists in the middle of the spectrum. So that's when you can also do a case comparison on what is most probable to happen on both sides. So you can talk about what is the situation likely to look like in your side of the debate versus the situation that's likely to look like on their side of the debate, comparing these two situations and telling the judge why you still win. Now, I would want to note that while I'm giving you guys advice on like gaslighting and manipulating the judge and trying to like illustrate the other team's side on the other team's world in a way that makes it sound that it isn't the most preferable thing or makes it sound bad, you would still want to be charitable, especially when you are trying to compare what the most probable case on both sides look like. You want to give it the most charitable illustration and explanation, since you are also aware that you can't really win on the extremes. So because of that, you would want to make sure that in this middle ground, that you're being as fair as possible to the other side and being as realistic as possible as to what the situation might look like. And the reason why this is going to help you is because if you manipulate the judge too much and you paint a very extreme picture on what happens or what the other side looks like, this is when you give the opportunity to the other team and say, judge, look, this team has been incredibly uncharitable. Let us tell you what actually happens. And if the judge buys that explanation, you are going to be left like seen like mean people, right? You're going to be left looking like the bully in the debate. So you don't want to have that look on you. You want to always make sure that you're seen as a side that's charitable, that's being nice, that's doing everything in the debate to win, while also furthering the discussion and allowing the other side to have a chance to engage with you. And if you allow the other side to have a chance to engage with you, that also makes the debate a lot better. It increases the quality of the debate, which gives everyone much higher speaker points. Then it's a win-win situation. Although I understand the priority here is winning the entire debate, but at the same time, you want to make sure that the debate can elevate to a point of maturity that that is nice to listen to, that is a good discussion to watch, right? Versus just two sides trying to manipulate each other and trying to manipulate the judge into believing their side while being uncharitable. That's not really the best discussion, especially from a judge's point of view. Now, that is for the arguments. And I understand that there might be a lot of questions that you guys might have. Although like we can leave these questions to the end of the session, or if you have any specific questions, you can just reach out to me directly, and I'll try and deal with those questions. And I understand that a lot of these questions might have to do with how do I come up with a premise, how do I analyze, etc., etc. And I can't really deal directly with these questions now because I'm not sure what these questions are. But in terms of expanding arguments, the tip that I would give you guys, or a very quick kind of advice that I can give you, is always ask questions. Always ask why, always ask how, always ask why is this likely to happen? Why is this important? Why should you care about this? Why is this such an urgent issue? And that is when we are able to develop arguments to a point where they can be concluded and they can sound comprehensive, versus them just sounding like one-liners that are being given. Okay, so that is what I would say for argument construction in the PM speech. Let's then move on to impacting. And this is also kind of a part of the argument itself. I would say that this is the last or final part of the argument, right? And I would say two things under this. Number one is on outcomes. So impacting, when we talk about outcomes, is telling me or telling the judge why this is an outcome that I have to care about. And this can be something that is positive. Maybe it's a really important benefit that you would want to talk about, or this can be something that is negative as well. So maybe it's a really dire consequence that cannot be ignored. So that is the first thing. The second thing here is on the reaction of the stakeholders. So remember, stakeholders are people that are affected by the debate, and this is something that we talked about in the framing, right? So when we're talking about outcomes, the reaction of the stakeholders also have to be taken into account. Are the people who are the focus of this debate and the focus of this motion reacting in a manner that we want to react, that we want them to react? Are they going to maybe if it's about a certain maybe it's about positive behavior, more climate positive behavior from average people? Is this outcome going to ensure that? Is it going to guarantee that? Is the government going to craft policies that's going to help people now that this argument has been made? What is happening is the question that you need to ask. And answering that question that can be done in this way, where you talk about why the benefit is so good that it cannot be ignored, why the consequence is so bad that it needs to be solved, or how do the stakeholders react, and are they reacting in the way that we want them to react? Is it in the positive ways? Is it in especially when we talk about government policy making and actions and stuff like that? That is on outcomes. Secondly, that is on metrics. And I feel like this is something that is a cheat code. And that is because I realized that just by labeling the importance of the things that you're talking about gives you an upper hand. What do I mean by this? So when we talk about metrics, we're simply saying criteria, right? Have my arguments met a certain criteria for it to be categorized as important? And there are a few metrics that are listed here, but trust me when I tell you that metrics or criteria can be anything you want to talk about. However it is you want to frame an argument as important can be a metric. And there are a few here which we will go through, and that is firstly on magnitude. Now, magnitude is numerical, right? If we talk about a 5.7 magnitude earthquake versus a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, the 6.5 is a lot greater. The same way, if we are able to prove why we help a greater number of people, our argument is greater in magnitude. So if we show that we help a greater number of people, we win on the metric of magnitude. Maybe, but secondly, it might not be magnitude. Maybe even if we help less people, maybe this is a benefit that's more proximate to this group of people. Maybe, for example, if we talk about minority groups, if we are able to solve for them racial inequality, that might be an issue that's more pertinent to them versus getting high-paying jobs that that they might not be able to access either way, right? So this might be a more proximate benefit to them. Thirdly, it's sustainability. And while talking about sustainability, I want to talk a bit about time frame, right? So a lot of times, you would want to try and win the debate in the long term, right? Because you don't want your benefits or whatever it is you might be talking about to only exist as a short-term kind of solution or a short-term kind of remedy. You want to make sure that things can exist and people can, change behaviors and mentalities deep into the future to the point that we can't even see it, right? Although winning in the short term is also kind of beneficial. When can this be beneficial? When we talk about a crisis, this might be an economic crisis where people are suffering and people are struggling and they need that short-term remedy. So that's when a short-term benefit can be important. But while talking about that short-term benefit, I would also try and kind of frame the short-term benefit as something that appears to be long-lasting into the future, just to make sure I'm checking that sustainability metric. Because as people, as humans, we kind of have a bias for something that's more long-term. If a politician promises you like change that can last for a month versus a politician promising you change that can last for 5 years for their entire tenure, then I'm pretty sure you would go for the latter, right? We kind of have a bias for something that's a lot more sustainable. And especially now, it's very easy to prove why sustainability is important. Resources are scarce, that we are kind of running out of time with a lot of issues. We need to solve things a lot better, and we need to do this in ways that are sustainable, that can last long into the future. And that is another box that you can check in terms of metric. Next is on knock-on impacts. So when we talk about knock-on impacts, it means we're trying to show why our argument is kind of holistic, right? That while we are trying to tackle one issue, we are also able to tackle this other issue. So for example, if the motion is about why scholarships should focus more on groups of people or groups of students coming from impoverished areas or minority groups, for example, the knock-on impact that we get is, like the way I would phrase it, is that, Judge, the benefit that we get here isn't just that we are able to increase the percentage of minority children or minority students or poor students furthering their education to like tertiary education, but we also get the benefit of increasing the percentage of minority individuals that maybe go on to work in high-paying jobs or high-skilled jobs, right? Because tertiary education is necessary in order to work in these high-skilled jobs. So that kind of reduces the disparity, especially when we look at high-paying job fields like in the STEM field or whatever, where there's a disparity in terms of the participation of the different groups in this particular field, is when we are able to prove something a lot more holistic. So we're not just proving this X benefit, but we also get this Y benefit in the process of pursuing this X benefit. So I think that is something that you can talk about. The last thing here is vulnerable groups. And the reason why, and in my notes, this vulnerable groups is kind of highlighted, and I always kind of highlight this for anyone that I'm coaching, and that is because it is very easy to win a debate or prove why an argument is important if you prove why it helps the smallest actor. If you can prove why the smallest possible person benefits from you doing this, then everything else becomes kind of self-explanatory, right? But by doing this, you also kind of check the proximity box, right? Because you can prove why these are benefits that need to kind of be accessed by these vulnerable groups, especially when maybe we talk about education. That needs to be that like education disparity is a very large issue, right? And that is something that we need to solve and something that we need to remedy. So if I can prove why vulnerable groups can have access to education now, that's a very good benefit that can be seen as important. And it's also a benefit that's a lot more proximate. So proving why these benefits can be accessed by the smallest actor is always the easiest kind of way you can prove why an argument is important, to be honest, right? So always try and think of who are the smallest actors firstly, who are kind of affected by this debate and affected in this motion, And then following that, any argument that you want to prove, any argument that you want to talk about, you can frame it in a way to say, how does this smallest actor then benefit from this? How do they then, maybe they benefit from like opportunity or access, or it might be like a direct benefit, like welfare, like aid or stimulus packages, etc. Right? So these are all ways that you can prove why something is really good for the small sector. Lastly, then is on the elbow speech. And so there's not much difference between the elbow speech and the PM speech, although there are a lot less responsibilities. But these are certain things that you probably want to take note of in the elbow speech. And that is firstly on a counter frame. So a lot of times you are going to deal with teams, especially in amateur debates and in lower level debates. You're going to deal with a lot of teams that set an unrealistic context, that set up unfair burdens, that give a mischaracterization or a wrong explanation of what the debate is actually about. And this is when you, as the leader of opposition, you kind of need to be sharp in identifying a lot of these problems with the Prime Minister's speech that came before you and re-characterize probably some of these things. So if the context was unrealistic, what exactly does the context look like? And you can use this to your benefit, right? So it doesn't have to be a binary, right? It doesn't have to be a right or wrong context. It might just be incomplete. It might just be unnuanced. And this is where you, as the leader of opposition, can enter the debate and explain why this piece of information, why this piece of context is meaningful to the debate. Maybe if we're talking about how some countries interact with each other, and they are saying like, this is actually how countries interact with each other, but you have some knowledge, some maybe specialized knowledge on the issue that you can add. You can say like, no, but if you look at 2006 or if you look at 2000 whatever, this is how these countries behave and this is how these countries took action at the time. So these are valuable contributions that can be made into part of the debate, especially when you want to run arguments that kind of are derived from this context and are kind of branching out from this main idea. So that's when you would want to push forth certain nuances that you feel are important, certain pieces of context which you feel is going to help not just the debate, but ultimately yourself improving a lot of the arguments that you want to talk about. So the second thing here is on responses. And although responses are not really the priority or the focus of the leader of opposition speech, I would still dedicate some time to it. And by doing this, and I mean, in the process of doing this, I'm not trying to respond to everything that is being said in the Prime Minister's speech. Obviously, I don't have the time to do that, right? Most of the rebuttals should be integrated within the arguments itself. Because in most debates, you will realize that all the arguments that you are running on both sides are just the flips of one another, if that makes sense, right? You're most of the time talking about the same issue, you're trying to reach the same end goal, but it's the process that you are undertaking in reaching that end goal that is different. So this is when a lot of the responses that you want to talk about, there are a lot of the responses that you want to make to the other team can already be kind of integrated within the argument itself. Now, what does this look like? So for example, if I am giving an argument on something and kind of deals with what the other team is saying, I'm going to flag it out. I'm going to tell the judge, this kind of also deals with the government claim on XYZ when they talk about this, right? And you have to explain how does this claim necessarily deal with what the other team has said. But if you're trying to make an isolated response, you're trying to make a response that is not integrated, I would say make it 3 levels. Number 1, in contesting the truth value of the statement. Why is this not true? And this is when you tell the judge that, this is not true for this reasons, right? This can be, factual knowledge. It can be a logical reason why it's not true, whatever. But then you move on to the second reason, where because sometimes you disproving the truth value of the statement or the truth value of the argument is not going to be enough. This is when secondly we say, why even if this is true, it's not important, right? So this is when you kind of are being charitable to the other team. You're saying, okay, I'll assume that whatever you said is true, but let me tell you why it's not important, right? And this is when you maybe, dilute the importance of the things that you talk about. You kind of try and minimize the benefits and impacts of the things that I'm talking about. If they claim that their benefits are able to reach like an X number of people, maybe you can say, no, it's actually just a Y number of people, which is much smaller. If they claim that their benefit is or like encompassing in many different areas, maybe you can say, no, it's actually just a one-dimensional kind of benefit that they get. But the third thing that you want to do then, and very importantly, is why even if this is important, this is still not as important as what we have talked about. And this is what we call weighing. And this is when, at the end of the response, we are going to simply assume everything that they say is true. We're going to assume that firstly, the truth value is something that is positive. So we say that, okay, that's a correct argument. That's a fair argument. And we're assuming the second component as well, that that's an important argument to make. You can give it credit for that. But we're not going to assume the third component, which is that they're more important than us. This is when we are going to weigh, right? And by weighing, we are going to assume the importance that they have said, right? Assume that they have a benefit that is as encompassing, a benefit that is as impactful as what they say it is. But then we're going to compare it to what we have. That even if whatever they say we can assume to be true, as charitable as possible, why it's still not as important as the contributions or the material or the ideas or the other argument that is in our speech. And I have realized that by doing this multi-level responses thing, even in the first speech itself, a lot of times judges are saying that these issues have already been resolved in the first speech, that the first speech already kind of responds to this. And that is when I realized that just by virtue of having different levels of my responses just in the first speech, judges are going to see the effort that you're putting into that response, and they're going to assume that to be a fair response to make, and you're going to assume that to be complete as well. And by having a complete response, and especially when you're dealing with the core ideas that the speech before you talked about, that is when you're not just giving your team that advantage and setting themselves up for victory, but you're also helping them, right? You're reducing their workload. You're aiding them so that they don't have to make more responses than they need to, so that maybe they can focus more on the nuanced parts of the debate. Maybe they can focus more on the parts of the debate that is not the core issue, but more of a breakdown, maybe different sub-branches of the debate. And you make it much easier, right? Because you are completing these responses to these core ideas within your speech, and you give your second speech a lot more like room to like explore different parts of the debate. So that's when maybe you don't have to have a second speech that's only doing comparisons. You don't have to have a second speech that's only weighing the debate, but you can have a second speech like that's paired with like two new arguments or two new extensions that can kind of just make your case a lot more holistic and a lot more comprehensive in the process. So that is why I said that the first speech is very important, because by doing this, you can kind of cause a domino effect, right? So assuming I don't make these responses, right? That means my second speaker now has to make these responses. And by them having to make these responses, it means they might not have enough room in their speech to make a certain response. And so this response might need to be passed down to the whip speech. So the whip speech now is not going to be able to focus on more of the bigger picture of the debate and breaking down clashes, but now they have to make this response in order for the judge to see why this big picture characterization or this clash analysis on why you want something that is fair. So see like how it's all a domino effect. And if you just make this response in the first speech, you would have been able to help your team, and it would have gone a long way, right? Where it all just results in different speeches that have been given and speeches that could have had more material, more new contributions within the speech itself, which I think is really good. And that is how I think you can win from the first speech itself. And I hope that this has been a beneficial workshop for you guys. And thank you so much.
One question.
Yes.
So like as a peer speaker, right, how much weight or how much priority do you give to pre-buttals or trying to preempt the like hot cakes and trying to rebut it first? Do you think it's like worth it or not worth the strategy?
Okay, personally, I don't do it unless I feel like it's worth it. And what do I mean by worth it is a few things. Number one, I don't have enough material in my speech. I don't have enough like original material in my speech that can just stand on its own. So I kind of need to make that preemptive rebuttal to kind of, fill up the speech. But also secondly, if I feel like I can just like my arguments itself is kind of a preemptive rebuttal to whatever argument that they are going to make, then I can just flag it out. So it's not, at that point, it doesn't become about whether or not it's worth it. It's that you just have an opportunity to do it. So why not do it, right? So you can kind of deal with that earlier. In terms of how much it is valued, that is really subjective to the judge, because some judges might just see it as value neutral, given that we haven't heard anything from the other team yet. So, teams can just change up certain strategies as they go. So if you have already preactively dealt with that, they might change it up and they might roll with something else. But it's fine, right? As long as you made it, if you utilize an opportunity, I would say go for it. But don't try and like crack your head and try to think of a preemptive rebuttal. I think that that's just counterproductive. And if you can't think of anything that you want to preemptively deal with, just go with what you originally planned. The more unique materials that you want to bring on from your side.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, Ahsan.
All right.
I think we can just cut the screen here. And please join us after lunch for our last session of the day. All right, how do I